Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney, and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. Over the last 2 years, I've interviewed over 170 people around this question, not to provide you with a universal answer, but to help you find and define your own answer to this question. On the 41st episode of the What is a Good Life podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Smith of Mark Smith Photography as our guest. Mark is a wildlife photographer, videographer, and storyteller whose stunning work has amassed a huge online following with hundreds of millions of views on YouTube and elsewhere. In this episode, Mark shares with us his sense and experiences of flow from his work. We reflect on the beauty and awe of both being in the wild and being present with it. He talks about the inspiration he takes from nature regarding the seemingly insurmountable odds and significant obstacles he sees being faced every day. Mark also shares a touching and surreal account of his communication with the family of cranes that later provided him with inspiration, perspective, and supported his healing when dealing with his own personal tragedy of suddenly losing his wife. Like his work, this conversation gives us an insight into a world that most of us could probably greatly benefit from experiencing more often. This episode also offers a unique perspective on observing and navigating the cycles of life and the joys and the hardships that go with it. For those of you listening to this on the podcasting platforms, we actually recorded this episode during the summer with Mark out in the woods. So the sounds that you hear accompanying this are the rather fittingly intermittent chirpings of nature. Look, I took a hell of a lot from this conversation. Mark's enthusiasm for his work, for life, for observing life means that he's developed a number of insights in terms of how we engage with, experience, and interpret the fluctuations of life. So I'm sure you'll take a lot from this episode as well. And if you enjoy this conversation, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you're on the podcasting platforms, please leave a review, as I greatly appreciate your support at this stage of my podcasting journey. So without further ado, the 41st episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. Mark, thank you very, very much for joining me on the What is a Good Life podcast today. I see that you're in perfect situ or location given your calling in life. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure. And it's kind of actually neat to be where I am to do this too. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
and thanks for having me.
Cheers. As I kick these off, Mark, it's with the question of, is there a question you're trying to answer as you move through life?
Oh, wow. I would say there's almost an infinite well of questions I'm trying to answer as I move through life. And each day and more experience, you kind of get answers to some, and then more questions kind of pop up. So, yeah, for sure. Specifically though, I don't know. It's a pretty wide and varied list.
Yeah. Is there, in terms of how you approach life, Mark, is there, I don't know, is there something that you're seeking an answer to, or even in the line of work that you're in, or the situations you find yourself in?
I wouldn't say that there's an answer that I'm seeking. More, there's a connection I think that I find when I do this stuff that's very comforting to me, and it's kind of puts me in a really good meditative state, and I get really balanced when I do all of this. So I think that's part of the attraction to it. Um, but as I go, the one thing that I learned, I go out and I do a lot of stuff with wildlife, but I meet amazing people along the way, and those always end up becoming the highlights of my journeys, is meeting and making friends with people all over the world. And that's an unexpected one for sure for me.
And so, even with that, Mark, was when you're talking about connection, and even with people, is that like an unexpected byproduct of like the engagement or the meditative state, or the headspace that almost the wildlife and the attention to your surroundings brings?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of people who pursue this type of, I don't know if you want to call it art form or hobby, like wildlife photography and or videography, are all kind of like-minded, and they're already fascinated with everything around them. So you find that you are around like-minded people, and you have a lot of the same values and views of things, and you kind of fit like really quickly, and you can bond through these experiences, I think, in a way that you can't with other stuff. I would relate it a lot to like Anthony Bourdain did good stuff when he would eat with people, because they all bonded over a common thing, and that was food. So regardless of your views or even the language, you were all there doing something that you understood and loved. And it's kind of the same aspect as that. So they might be completely strangers when you meet them, but within a day or two, you feel like you've known them your whole life, and you can have almost this instant bond with them, and it's really amazing.
When you describe that, is that I'm almost getting the sense that it's not like you necessarily, and correct me if I'm wrong on this assumption, you're not even talking about then like exchanging life stories or anything like that. There's just something communal about the purpose, but it sounds too focused on something. But it sounds almost like just like the aspect of the community, something so communal or something so bonding is what brings you together.
Yeah, very very much so. There's like the common desire to be in these moments, like maybe even record them, talk about them, and then share them later. I think it's interesting. My son and my son comes with me a lot on this. He's 25, and he loves it just as much as I do, and we talk a lot about stuff. And with like the AI stuff on the forefront, things are kind of weird, especially with photography right now. But the whole aspect of all of this is that can never replace the experience, and the experience that you have doing it, or the experience you have with these other people. So it's something about that experience, that bonding, that makes it so magical. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it definitely does, and I think it's I don't know. Even in watching some of your videos and your photography over the last few weeks, it kind of brings me into a place of some part of me is envious for for what you're experiencing, or it just seems so. Like it seems so deeply connecting, even with the like. It's one thing to even be out in nature, but it seems to be another thing to be so focused or so still while in that, like not necessarily. I know you may have a mission to capture an image, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming there's a lot of stillness in your day in some of these excursions.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think that's kind of what I was saying earlier. Like in the middle of it, even in an extremely exciting event, there's a lot of things that you have to balance if you want to capture it like in a good way. So you have to balance the animal behavior. You have to understand that a little bit. You have to balance your camera settings and how the light is at the current situation, and you have to balance yourself a little bit. So you get into like this zone, like what they would call the flow, to where even though you're there with all these other people, the moment you're doing this, everything else kind of melts away, and you're just there in that moment, living it. Kind of again, like kind of by balancing all of these things. So it kind of like for me, I find it very grounding and very. Uh, I guess still would be a good word, but at the same time, not.
How would you describe it further?
Oh, oof. There, there is a stillness, but there's also an element, like an underlying element of excitement to it as well. And then there's a learning experience with it too, as far as what you're seeing and processing it as it's happening in your own mind, and understanding the behavior or whatever it is that you're a part of. Ooh, that's really tough to quantify, to put into words. It's very difficult. Like where I am now, we're here to see this really unrivaled spectacle of eagles. Sometimes there's 300 of them at a time, and they get into this feeding frenzy that's all a natural occurrence. And I don't think, from my knowledge, that this happens anywhere else in the world. And I've tried my best to portray it to people with video and still imagery, but you can't accurately do that. You have to really put the person in the middle of it, and then and that's what we've been doing for the past 2 weeks here. And then to see them in the middle of it, then oh wow, yeah, this is, oh, it really, everybody, it's taken their breath away, and they've left rejuvenated, like they almost as if like the day-to-day grind of everyday life kind of depletes away at the human experience, and when they come here and do this, that gets refilled. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, that makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
There's something, I don't know, just so beautiful though. I think by the like any moments of that we come into almost contact with awe, like where I love this idea too. Despite the technology that you're using, that even of that kind of high quality, it still can't you still never felt like you captured the essence or the presence of the moment.
Yeah, I don't know if it's possible in certain circumstances. I mean, you can do your best, and you can give people a vague idea, but they have to be there to experience that to really fully understand it.
This lovely idea though you had there of like almost the rejuvenation of people, like going out on these excursions or being out in these in moments in nature where, especially when you're talking about this 300 gathering of 300 eagles, where it's obviously particularly stunning. This idea of rejuvenation, how big a part does that play in your life in terms of the coming back to the work that you do? Like how important is that rejuvenation part to this?
I think it's pretty vital to it, but I think again there's more to it for me. There's a parallel between a lot of the trials and tribulations that we have and the animal world has. At least I see it that way. And I take a lot of great inspiration from watching these creatures and seemingly impossible uh, instances overcoming it. And like to me, it's humbling, very, very much. Makes me feel very small and simple when I see this, and it really makes me understand that what I think is a big, huge, blown out problem really is inconsequential by comparison. So it's it's very humbling in that sense, and inspirational too. Like again to see these things and say, okay, I'm upset today because the air conditioner in my house broke. Right, something tiny, but this bird might have missed its fish, and it's in like 40 degrees Fahrenheit water, and another eagle might have just taken its eye in the process, and it might die simply because it needed to get a piece of food. I mean, so it's
Yeah.
it's very humbling in that sense too. So I think that's really important. And again, I think that comes back to like the grounding and the rejuvenating too. It humbles you and grounds you, and if you look at it with the right mindset.
Can you think of some of the key lessons that you've learned? Like I know you're giving the example there of a bird coming down that's starving for food and losing its eye in the process. But like, are there other kind of things that have particularly stuck out to you in terms of of what you've been trying to capture, where you've like, holy shit, that really that really made me ponder life, or this really made me take on things with a different perspective.
Yeah, I would say there's a kind of an underlying theme with all of it, and that is like the tenacity of these animals in the face of huge odds to survive and continue to do what they do on a daily basis. I think that's one of the big things for me. So again, it's kind of inspirational in that sense to see. I was recently off the coast of Washington State, photographing some foxes that are pretty well known. They're pretty habituated in an area. They were introduced by man to try to control a rabbit population. But some of these foxes live in this meadow that's a good ways away, and they get preyed on by bald eagles, like the baby foxes. And it's a well known thing. And most people go to this place to photograph the cuteness of these baby fox kids. And while I was there, I had a couple of days where I watched these two eagles just constantly trying to steal the fox babies. And there was one moment, it's really hard to describe, but where an eagle came into the den, tried to grab a fox kit, and the fox kit dove into the den. You can see its little tail, go straight in. But then something happened that I never expected. There were four adult foxes, and they pretty much came from every direction and tried to snatch that eagle out of the air. At all costs, they had to eliminate this thing. All three of them missed, and like off in the distance there was one fox kit wide out in the open, and the eagle came right in on it. And from out of nowhere, the last remaining adult fox literally jumped up and threw its body on the kit to protect it from the incoming eagle, and the eagle bailed at that last second. And that was like a learning experience to me that showed, I don't know, the tenacity of these creatures. That people are there for the cutesy moment of the baby fox, but there was a battle ensuing there that was life or death. And it was every 10 or 15 minutes that they had to do this. So it was, again, kind of back to that same common thread. It's very humbling. It's like, wow, I don't have it so bad.
It's amazing though, just the like just the drive, whether it's in humans and animal, like, obviously when we're in this very comfortable scenario now, if we live in certain parts of the world, and as you said, like if your biggest complaint was my AC isn't working today, and then I'm out seeing this, it puts things in perspective. But it is amazing it must be so amazing to appreciate on such a frequent basis this innate kind of striving we have just to survive sometimes, like beyond beyond trying to put, like, even the struggles that humans face so regularly. And I'm not trying to, this is a less glorious thing, the impression that you're giving, but there's some people in Berlin, where I'm based at the moment, where I used to live in a certain part of town where I'd see this guy begging, and he usually would have different scabs over him. So I assume he's addicted to something, and I'm always amazed when I go back there around once every 6 months or a year, that he's still there, if you know what I mean.
Oh
Like,
yeah, yeah.
and I don't know, like it's amazing, even just in that scenario. I've just a huge amount of respect for him, if you know what I mean, or just
Oh,
because
definitely.
he represents something in that moment to me of like, Jesus, he's just, his life looks pretty hard and he's still going, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I know exactly what you mean, and I've seen a lot of homelessness and stuff like that where I go in certain places, and I always end up thinking, how hard their life must be for them to actually be there to do that. That there's a sense of pride that has to go away for that to happen, for people, and that's tough.
Do you, just out of interest, has observing animals to this extent, has it altered how you also, do you view Homo sapien in similar ways, or do you take a different perspective on how you survey things when you're not behind the camera?
Oh, most definitely. Photography really teaches you to see the world in a different way, in multiple ways. Not only do you, like, after a while, like, you develop kind of an eye for like an artistic moment that might be happening. Like, you could be on a beach, and suddenly a sailboat drives between a couple peaks in the, or, comes by between a couple peaks in the distance, and it's like a perfect composition. So you can kind of see this painting in the moment. But then, in the same sense, kind of like what you're saying with this homeless person, there is a constant struggle that you can see with people in their day-to-day lives, be it like homelessness, or maybe even somebody that has a very stressful job. You can kind of relate it to the same, to the human experience as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
yeah, it does. It has also taught me to I don't know, to be more open to everybody's experience. I don't have any idea what any person is going through at any moment in their lives, and you should never really make a judgment based off of a rash moment they might be having. Who knows what could have happened to them? So same with like a lot of the wildlife. They go through these problems, and they might be cranky one day. Like, there's a pretty good instance. We had an osprey that we would regularly photograph, and we called it Cheeky because it had a big fish hook stuck in its cheek and like 3 feet of line coming down. It was the most aggressive osprey I've ever seen. It would attack any other osprey that came within feet of it, even if it already had a feed. It could have a fish in its talons, and another one came in, and it's like, oh, no, no, no. And it would go out and attack and drop the fish just to fend off its area. And, we think it was solely an act of aggression from this injury. Like, it had to fight twice as hard because of this injury to establish its dominance in the area. So you can kind of sympathetically see that in the human experience as well with certain individuals. And I don't know, depending on how you see things, you can kind of defuse a tense situation if you're kind of calm, like you would be in those situations, and bring it into the human experience. Sometimes just a subtle little distraction is all it takes to bring somebody off the ledge, so to speak, and calm them down and get them kind of back into balance, if that makes sense. And I've
Yeah, yeah,
learned
yeah.
I've learned a lot of that through a lot of these experiences with animals, because I see a lot of that happening with them as well.
Just, I think this is so interesting though, with lots of different, let's say, wildlife programs I've watched down through the years, or even just witnessing nature up front as well. It's amazing that when you're watching, what I also find so interesting when you're watching it from one animal's perspective, like when they're the main character in the story, so to speak,
Hmm.
you're rooting for them.
Right.
Like if you're showing me something where a particular osprey is starving, I'd almost want it to get the fish, if you know what I mean. But
For
if
sure.
you were shooting this from the perspective of
The fish.
this school of fish, you know what I mean,
Oh
or
yeah.
even like, and I'm like, God damn that evil osprey. So it's super interesting too, even just from whose perspective you're also watching the story from as well.
Oh yeah. Well, definitely. There is a good dose of speciesism that happens with wildlife photography and animals and stuff. And I have I have a very short clip that I had posted sometime about a year ago where I was photographing or filming a baby loggerhead sea turtle as it made its way down the beach to the water. And as I was filming it, a crab came from out of nowhere, picked it up and carried it away. Like it happened so quickly, I didn't even really know how to respond. I was like, I see the crab coming, like, oh, that's weird. What's the crab doing? And then it picked this turtle up and ran full speed. I was like, oh my God, what is it doing? And a friend of mine that was there with me, stood up and kind of chased the crab away and it dropped the turtle. But in the video, I kind of wanted to demonstrate the struggle. And I didn't want to show the part where the crab dropped the turtle. I wanted everybody to be like, oh, this is hardcore, but not in the sense of uh, not in the sense of like just like pure violence or anything like that, but in the sense of, hey, this is what happens out there. This little turtle, it's got a tough life. Um,
Yeah,
but I ended up getting attacked like massively online because I let it happen. That was the thing. How could you not
yeah,
interfere with this? And that's a good example of what you're talking about. Ultimately, the crab has to eat too. It
yeah,
does. As sad as it might be because the turtle might be endangered or anything like that. And yeah, we can do our best to help them. That would kind of disrupt the whole flow of things and the natural flow of things. That's if one thing I've learned doing this is Mother Nature always has a way to kind of figure out the balance on her own and will demonstrate it constantly over and over and over again. And kind of like where we are now, there is this weird phenomena that happens where these fish get stuck in a current and brought up from like 1,000 feet to the top, and they get like a compression sickness where all the air inside of them expands, and they get stuck on the surface and they can't go anywhere. They're gonna die from this upwelling of water. But it's like Mother Nature's like, well, we have the eagles to come clean all that up. So it's like this balance back in place again. And yeah, it's really sucks for this fish, right? Imagine you're cruising along, oh, and all of a sudden you get blown to the surface, you get the bends, like your eyeballs inflate, and then you get eaten alive by an eagle. I mean, that's rough. But again, there's like this balance there that's happening, that seems to happen all the time. And again, like back to the turtle and the crab has to eat too. As hard as it is to watch something like that, you have to really kind of have the perspective of that balance that this is the way things are, unfortunately, and they kind of have to remain that way at times as well. So I wouldn't say it's perfect. I mean, it's good and it's close, but I think a lot of times as humans we think we're smarter and we want to fix something, and I think history has shown that that's almost always a mistake. That Mother Nature has its own solution in play, and it will kind of sort it out on its own. Might not be perfect, especially from a human perspective. Um, and there's also the where people like to anthropomorphize feelings into these animals. And I don't know, I've seen and experienced a lot of interesting stuff with wildlife, and I would be one of the first people to do that. I fully think that they have a layer of emotions and feelings that we just don't really perceive in the same way. I've seen it. So for me, it's easy for me to do that, because I've seen a lot of suffering and what appears from a human form to be, actual emotional behavior between, certain animals. So
how do you are you sometimes emotionally affected by what, like, have you seen something where you're like, man, that, like, you put the camera down and you just kind of sat and thought about it, like, where the, like, almost this perception of emotional suffering from an animal that it would you'd feel it too then almost on reflection, or how do you kind of deal with that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, no, 100%. I, I have a really weird example to illustrate that, and I have to try to tell it in a very short story. Um, I followed a family of cranes at one time early on doing this for about 3 months, and I wanted to document like the life and birth of their baby, and then the trials and tribulations that it went through to kind of show people the struggle that these animals have. Again, back to the we don't have it as bad as we think type of mentality. And it was a great learning experience. And the end result was nothing I would have ever anticipated. In my mind, I was like, okay, I see the local predators like an alligator or this bird or that bird. They're going to be the bad guys in the play, so to speak, trying to take the baby. But in the end, the experience was disrupted by a human, and it was something that I would have never anticipated. Long story short, I got very close with this family. They let me in many times. I just sat with them and just watched, in amazement at what they were doing. And they were never really bothered by my presence. Not like I went up to them. There were times where I'd park myself in a specific place, and they would come to me and just kind of surround me. Then you have to put the camera down. You have to, and just kind of understand what's happening around you and just watch it to be present. But ultimately, what happened was a really bizarre experience. The mother ended up getting hit by a car and was in a ditch on the side of the road. And in this experience, I showed up one day and I couldn't find the whole family. I could only find two, and I could tell it was the father and the chick. And the father was making this really bizarre noise, almost mourning noise that I'd never heard them make before. And it was very upsetting to me. I knew something was extremely wrong. I had to leave the area because a storm rolled in, and I went home and I got my son, and I wanted to bring him back to ground me because I was emotionally invested in this family. And I wanted him to be there to say, hey, yeah, maybe you're overreacting to all this. So we get back to this little place where they were, and the male is still there, and he's still making this really sad, mournful noise. And I looked at my son, like the male kind of started to approach us, and I looked at my son and said, oh my God, I know what's happened. The female's been hit by a car, and she's in a ditch on the side of the road. And my son looked at me and goes, okay, now you're overreacting, Dad. That's not what's going on here. And as soon as I said that to him, the male went around us and started to go outside of this facility where we were towards the road, towards the ditch. And I said, we got to follow him. He's going to show us where she is. And sure enough, that's what he did. He led us to where she was and then left. And we tried to save her. Ultimately, she couldn't survive. She had been hit by a car, and it was devastating for her. We took her to an animal rehab. They tried their best and ultimately had to euthanize her like within 48 hours. I still to this day cannot explain how I came to that conclusion that she was in a ditch on the side of the road and been hit by a car. I had no prior knowledge to any of that, and I'm glad my son was there to see it as well, because had he not been there, nobody I think would have ever believed me. That tore me up for a good 5 or 6 days. I was very, 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 very sad about that whole experience. But what's even more bizarre, and this one is really hardcore, is I watched this family do what they did, and I watched the female, get taken out by a human and die. And I found myself 3 years later in almost the same exact situation. My wife of 25 years had an like instant aneurysm and died within 12 hours. And so I was kind of in the same exact situation as this Sandhill Crane family. Now here I am with my two surviving children. Granted, they had one, and I now need to kind of continue on with my kids. So there was this parallel there that was almost foreshadowing what would happen to me in the future, which was it's very weird to look at it now from a different perspective, um, from a somewhat healed perspective. I don't think you really ever heal from this type of experience, but it's interesting to see it now and to see those parallels again and to kind of dig in and use that as like the motivation to strive and continue, to keep going through these tough situations. So yes, it has affected me emotionally on several instances, for sure. I think it's hard not to. I don't think I would want to not be affected emotionally by it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Very sorry to hear about your wife, Mark. That's an incredible story in terms of just the connection you're making to foreshadowing as well. Like what that's and then just as you've been kind of touching on all the time, like how the animals and their instinct to survive is the thing that you find almost most inspirational, and then this tragic situation in your own life appears as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it, I guess hardcore was the good way to describe it. It was pretty tough. I mean, still is, but yeah, it definitely like there was some definite healing moments too afterwards where I went out with the animals every day, and I saw that fire for survival in their eyes, and I used that in my own way to kind of work my way through a lot of this stuff. So definitely.
How just there's a couple of questions, even just about your interaction with those animals, but just in terms of just the like almost the cycle of life was a question I wanted to ask even before you mentioned this, but just in terms of just seeing like all this all this playing out so often in animals, survival, all of these things, like does that bring you a like a different perspective even just beyond the observation of survival, like the like almost the order of life, birth and death and so forth and survival in between, like has that affected you quite profoundly as well in terms of just observing this play out in the in nature so often?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's hugely beneficial, especially when you can relate it to maybe instances in your own life. So yeah, it almost kind of like a type of therapy, if you will. I mean, it's you can have this vicarious experience, and again, you can relate it back to yourself and the bigger picture of everything. So yeah, and you get to with wildlife, you get to see that lifetime in a much shorter span of time. You get to see all of the experiences they have in a much shorter span of time, in relevance to time to the human experience. So
Yeah. Isn't this story though of actually feeling like you'd got clear instruction or to follow the father, and then to find his as the mother? Have you ever reflected on that in terms of just like what the hell was communicated there, or like do you know? Because I'm fascinated in those kind of experience, almost like in an energetic exchange or a transfer of knowledge or communication beyond the spoken word or language, if you get me.
yeah, I 100% think about it a lot, and I do think something like that happened because there's no way that I can't put my finger on anything else. I don't know how that idea just suddenly appeared to me, but science is interesting anyways because we learn new things every day, and we're only built to perceive the world in a way for our survival, where everything else is built to perceive it in a different way. So I'm fully open to the idea that there are a lot of things happening around us that we're not aware of, that we can measure in a scientific formula or way, that might be happening. And this was, I would say, was one of those instances to where we don't have any type of device to say, oh, there was some sort of energy transmission there that happened, and that's why this human now understood what was going on with this bird. But I fully think something like that happened. I can't really explain it any other way, to be honest. So, and to be so precise like that, and I mean, I could see maybe if I said, oh, maybe she's been hit by a car, but to know, I mean, I knew for a fact, without a doubt, that she'd been hit by a car and she was stuck in a ditch on the side of the road. And then to watch him lead us out right to her, I was like, oh, okay, that's yeah, very strange.
But I was wondering, like, do you think, when you're saying that we're designed almost to perceive life a certain way, and like not many people that may be listening to this, or that like are, let's say I was born in Dublin in a city, I live in Berlin in a city, okay, I've lived in the countryside before for a year in Peru, but by and large I've been based in cities, got such a narrow, like almost narrow level of senses, or that we're blunt instruments anyway in perceiving maybe almost like a quantum reality. Like, you know, that you and I are made of atoms and they're 99.9999% space and everything feels very solid. So we're kind of blunt instruments even in perceiving that. But I mean, just in a natural sense, like if people go to an office or they live in, like, they're spending most of their time indoors or these kind of things, like I'm be so intrigued as to what like senses or what capacities that we're dulling all the time with the way many of us are going about our lives, that perhaps that obviously that's not the same case for what how you're approaching life.
Yeah. Yeah. I would think so. I think. I don't know. I mean, we're all different. You know, maybe some people are better at perceiving other human beings, and they have insight into another human being in the same way. You know, through a process that we can't measure. You know, we all have our own, I guess, journeys and unique windows into everything. So, but I do think there is a dulling for sure by just the, I guess, the way that society is as a whole. I think there's somewhat of a dulling experience to it, a numbing agent, so to speak, that might not be there as a child, but as you grow up, it like just the harshness and reality of life sometimes kind of cuts away a lot of this stuff, you know. And yeah, I guess a stressful job in the city could also be a factor in that. So
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to sound too judgmental of myself and others,
oh, I don't want to
but
be that way either. Yeah. So
yeah, yeah, no. So, but I think I may have come across that way briefly. So, but yeah, that wasn't my intention. But but I do find it's really interesting. Even when you mentioned that you were just even sat with this family and you have to put your camera down, I do think that there's certain things, and this also even goes back to even like having, I guess, even mindful practices or even time away from technology, because these things are so powerful. But I really do love the idea of even just sat there in a moment and thing like creatures coming to you. And even, you know, even just from my relationship with my dog, I love looking at my dog and looking at her behavior and every little kind of nuanced thing, or things where she's just moving her paw in a different way.
right.
Like there's something really, I don't know, enriching about just an engagement with a creature in a, and having non-verbal communication or non-verbal relationships with other creatures as well.
I agree 100%.
In terms of like how you first got into this line of work, was this something that you were always following throughout your life, or kind of what was your route into this?
Yeah. Yeah. I've kind of been fascinated with nature ever since I was a little kid. My dad was really responsible for introducing me to a lot of things that I thought were kind of normal, but I've learned as I've gotten older, we're not, in the sense of um, interactions with wildlife and being immersed in it. You know, he would take my brother and I camping all the time when I was little in the middle of the forest. He got heavy into sailing, so we would spend a lot of time on the sailboat, kind of living off the ocean and spending 12 hours a day in the ocean snorkeling and all this amazing stuff. And I started photography way, way back then. I didn't really know what I was doing, but it was always fascinating to me to be able to capture a moment and then understand what was happening behind that moment, you know? So yeah, I've been fascinated with this for a long time, and I'm really kind of happy and excited that technology is at a point where it is, to where I can have this device in my hand that would have, like 10 years ago, would have taken a whole crew of people to do, you know? So it's been condensed into a smaller, easy to manage variable that allows me to capture more precise moments and share them with people and understand. But it's definitely been something I've been doing my whole life.
That's so. Did you like? At what point did you even kind of think that this could be something that I'd actually just do all the time? Even not trying to throw the label of work on something
Yeah.
that seems to be so kind of innate, or that was came across emerged so naturally. But like, was there a point where you're like, oh wow, I just get to I keep get to doing this?
Um, yeah. And I would say my son had a big, like, part of that. I would go off and do these things daily on my own, and I would come back and share these experiences with my family. And my son was adamant that I should create a YouTube channel and share these experiences that I was sharing with him with the world. He was for certain that people would just love it, and I was like, I don't think they're really going to care, you know. So he was instrumental in that, and I did. And when I saw a few things, when I saw how people reacted to it, that was great. But then this underlying thing started to happen that I wasn't really ever anticipating, and that was a lot of young people being exposed to these things and being fascinated and seeing maybe a change in their perception of the world around them because of it, and that was a huge influence as well. And it's hard to maybe think of the actual moment when I went, oh, I get to do this, because I think it was a gradual learning experience. It just slowly but surely became what it is.
And when you think of the, I don't know, even just it sounds something like, because the moment I saw the first year videos, I started watching a bunch of them. Like, it's amazing that you could even think though that like, oh, people maybe not care about this. Like when it's like, you know, an eagle swooping in, scooping up a fish, even eating it midair, and I'm just like, holy shit, what did I just see?
Yeah, yeah. Well, my perception of things when I started too wasn't there with that. It was smaller things that were I was more accustomed to that might be happening in and around me, and I'd experienced them for my whole life. 45 years. I had a really big epiphany one day that helped me understand all of this when I was in Colorado. So I'm born and raised in Florida. Did some traveling. Ended up staying and living in Colorado for a couple of years. And I had this idea one day when I was in the grocery store in the deli. There was a young woman working behind the deli, I'd say maybe early 20s. And it dawned on me that maybe she had never in her life seen a pelican. And I wanted to kind of figure this out. So I asked her just flat out. I said, it was a weird question to ask somebody. But as she was like, cutting up the stuff that I wanted, I asked her, I said, have you ever seen a pelican? And she responded, I could tell, a pelican. What do you mean? And I said, the bird, the pelican. And she said, "Oh no, I've never seen one before." And to me, that was a big aha moment. I was like, "Okay, these experiences that I've been living with, pelicans and all these other things all around me, are not everyday occurrences for the majority of people. So it would be beneficial to like start exposing them to all of these things, because she might not ever get to go see that in her experience where she is. And if I can open that window and actually give them a little point of view into it, and maybe make them realize this exists and maybe even smile, then yeah, that's a great thing."
Just in terms of then even your own evolution or your own relationship with what you're engaging in, I saw one video where you start off the day kind of completely transfixed by a great blue heron,
Mm-hmm.
and just the detail under its right eye, and like I like, which is just sometimes when I look at like natural shots, I'm just like, this world is crazy. Like, how does this time, like, how do all these species exist for starters? How do we exist even with all our various differences? Like, there's just something really kind of trippy about that. But then also, like, just curious, like, have you noticed a shift in your own subtlety and what you appreciate, like, or kind of, how would you say, have things shifted or evolved through your repeated process?
Mm. Yeah, I would say there's definitely more appreciation for everything, even the little tiny things around me. And then I'm always kind of thinking bigger picture too. And I remember one time I was photographing some tiny little oh, I can't think of what they're called right now. The tiny little bugs on the base of a flower. And as I was like peering onto them, I mean, they're tiny. They're like the size of a pinhead. And I was taking photos of them and understanding a little bit more about them, and relating that to what they were doing. I had this idea, here I am standing above this flower, transfixed on these little tiny creatures on the stem that are completely unaware of me. As far as I can tell, they have no knowledge of my existence here, spying on them. And when I had that idea, I kind of stood up and looked over my shoulder and thought, well, what could be having me under their lens right now doing the same thing? So yeah, it really it gives you a different outlook on everything. At least it has for me. So for sure.
I know there can be big spectacular moments that you can capture when, like when if it is an eagle or an osprey, even just plunging into the water and things like this. But like, are there kind of things that are there certain things that, like, what brings you joy? Does that shift, or is it the process that you were mentioning earlier, like control kind of, or presence in yourself, communication with the camera, then communication with the what's at the end of the camera, like, or that kind of presence and stillness, or are there things that you have preferences for?
I like the whole experience. I like every aspect of it. And there's always a few surprises too when you're doing this. You might be out there for a couple hours experiencing something, and you capture all of these moments, and then when you get back and start reviewing what you've captured, there's almost always something that happened underlying that you were completely unaware of, that you can learn about. It's like, oh, I didn't realize that. um, Another interesting thing that starts to happen is when you spend a lot of time around a specific group of animals, you start to see the individuals, be it because they have a fish hook in their face, or there's an eagle here that's missing almost all his tail feathers. So you can spot this one very easy, and you start to see their individual personalities. And again, this eagle that's missing all of its tail feathers, it's a young juvenile bird, but it is so good at catching fish. It catches more fish than most of them, at least as far as we can tell, because we can identify the one. But it's very keen on getting a feed, and it does so very, very well. And being able to, like, when you immerse yourself in there and you can see these physical traits that allow you to identify the individual, and then you can learn the personalities, it makes it even more of a special experience, because you can almost relate then with that individual, and you have this like, oh, I know this one, I know this one, and I know the behavior and what, and I don't know, you can relate to them kind of better that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely does. And I love the idea of just kind of seeing things almost as a uniform body at the start, and then you spend enough time with them, and then it's like now it's a level deeper. It could be physical differences, then it could be personality things that you notice. Like, it's like a just the longer you're kind of observing or in the presence of things.
Sure, yeah, definitely.
Um, Mark, just as I have a habit of asking people at the end of this, it's the question of what is a good life. I know you've mentioning things like connection, values, learning, inspiration, even that you get from nature, the grounding elements of nature as well, and then even just the humbling nature of the humbling ideas of observing nature. But what is a good life for you, sir?
Whew. I would say trying to remain present in all of these moments. That would really be definitive for it, and that makes a good life, because you can really appreciate everything that's happened. It's not always achievable. Sometimes it's easy to go backwards, or even forwards, but if you can find that balance and remain present, that makes a really good life.
And I guess within that, Denmark, it's like life can be rough, it can be smooth sometimes as well. It's the entirety, or it's taking it all in, and I guess appreciating it all.
Yeah, definitely. Like, the good wouldn't be so good without the bad. You got to have that balance. So
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Mark, I really appreciate you taking the time for the What is a Good Life podcast, especially on location as well, out of the
oh,
blue.
I appreciate
Really,
it.
really appreciate it. Thank you so much for all that you've shared, and I've been enjoying your work immensely, and I look forward to following it as well.
Well, thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it. It's been a fun experience for sure.